Now that we have a good understanding of the mechanics of elasticity of demand, we can think about some of its applications. Why do we care about how steep or how flat the demand curve is? I'm going to go into a couple of reasons for that in this video. Later in the video series on Chapter 6, we're actually going to see that it matters a lot for taxes and subsidies. How elastic or inelastic the demand curve is going to determine how much of the burden of a tax falls on buyers instead of sellers. But for this video series, I'm going to focus on two other applications of elasticity of demand. The first is that elasticity of demand is helpful in projecting how much growth or shrinkage is going to occur in a market over time. Okay, so let's think about the following two demand curves. The one on the left is more elastic, the one on the right is more inelastic. And ordinarily, if you're thinking about being a seller and thinking about which market you would rather be in, you probably would think that this second market with an inelastic demand curve is the more desirable market because you can raise prices without losing a lot of customers, losing a lot of sales. Whereas over here, raising prices is going to run out of quantity demanded pretty quickly. However, keep in mind that while it's true you'd rather be on a steep curve when prices are going up, you'd rather be on a flat curve when prices are going down. So think about a market like the market for, let's say, computing, or the market for music, which tends to be fairly elastic. Okay, as the price of computers has come down, we've found more and more places that we can use computers. So it used to be all computers were just, really large machines that were, could take up the entire floor of a building. They were very expensive, and they were applied to very technical scientific applications, such as NASA would use them, large companies would use them for analysis. Over the years, it's become cheaper and cheaper to produce computers. They've gotten smaller and smaller, and now we put computers into all sorts of things that people never would have thought to put a computer into. So now not only does every house typically have more than one computer, we put computers in our phones, we put computers in our cars, we even put small computer chips into various items around your house now. It's sometimes called the Internet of Things. Okay, so we expand our consumption of computers a lot as the price has gone down, and that's what this type of a demand curve would look like. Same thing with music. It used to be that if you wanted to listen to any music, you had to hire a band to come play for you, right? Before we had the ability to record music. But as that technology of recording music has gotten cheaper and cheaper and better, and we can provide copies of music, instantaneously on demand now with, say, streaming audio. The demand for music, the quantity demanded of music, has gone up very quickly, even as the price falls relatively by a relatively small amount. Okay, so what does that look like? Well, say we've got a supply curve that initially looks like this. Then the initial equilibrium price and quantity will be right here. Price, quantity, and we'll call that P1 and Q1. And we'll call this supply curve S1. So that's at an initial point in time. Now remember that as the technology of production gets better, what tends to happen is this supply curve shifts over time. In other words, companies tend to get better at producing a good the more experience they have with it, and the better they're able to build technology around producing that good. So over time, supply curves tend to shift to the right, which means that over time, prices tend to fall within a particular market. All right, now, what's that going to look like? Well, that's going to be a rightward and downward shift of the supply curve. S2. And now before I draw the price and quantity lines on the second equilibrium, first of all notice that these price and quantity lines, this maps out the total revenue when supply was more restricted. Now, as the supply curve shifts to the right, the price is going to fall, but only by a little bit. And the quantity demanded is going to increase by significantly more. So the equilibrium quantity shifts to here, Q2. The equilibrium price goes down to here, P2. And so you can see that now there is a larger revenue that's being earned in this market. This market is getting bigger in terms of revenue as supply shifts to the right. So yeah, there's a loss in revenue as the price falls, but that's more than compensated for by the extra sales. And this is exactly what you see in like the computer industry and the music industry over time. Price has fallen, and prices fallen considerably, but quantity demanded has gone up by even more. And so those industries are growing. Now, on the other hand, think of markets like the market for food. Okay, the demand curve for food is actually pretty inelastic because even though, yes, people eat more today than they did 50 years ago, and even though people eat more as the price of a good falls, as the price of food falls, you've only got one stomach, and there's just kind of some physical constraints on eating additional food that don't exist in the same way for listening to music, or to the same extent for listening to music or putting computers into various items. So if you start with a relatively restricted supply curve like this, S1, then in this market we'll have an initial equilibrium. At P1 and Q1, and there is the total revenue that's being earned. Now shift that supply curve to the right, and what you're going to find is not that many more units trading, and the price at which they are trading goes down by quite a bit. S2. There's the new price. Here's the new quantity. P2 and Q2. All right, so this new revenue amount is smaller than the old one because even though you have gained a few more trades, the price per trade has gone down by considerably more. Okay, so in a market like say agriculture, as the supply increases, in terms of revenue earned, you can actually have a shrinking market over time. There's less money to be had. The market is smaller than it used to be. Now, in terms of output, it's bigger. And American agriculture, in terms of output, is quite a bit bigger now than it was 50 years ago or 100 years ago. But if you look at the agrarian economy, agriculture in the United States as like a percent of GDP, it's much smaller today than it was 50 years ago or 100 years ago. So that's the first application, is understanding or having some ability to project what's going to happen to a market over time as the price, say, comes down with additional competition and better technology. The second and the final example of a policy application I'm going to talk about is the one that I motivated this discussion with at the beginning, which is the idea of drug prohibition. Okay, remember that the The argument is, will people still consume drugs, and also how many relative to if you removed prohibition? And which of these two demand curves describes the market for illegal drugs is going to have a big impact on, what would you call it, on the implications for fighting a war on drugs, for prosecuting a prohibition on drugs. And the reason for that is as follows. Well, first of all, let's think about which demand curve we think is closer. If you think about the responsiveness of drug users to price, do you expect them to be very sensitive to the price so that a drug that they use regularly, if that price goes up, do you think that they're going to change their behavior drastically by cutting back a lot of their consumption? Or do you think that most drug users would tolerate a pretty large increase in price and still not cut back on their consumption very much? My guess is it's probably here with an inelastic demand curve. In fact, that's one of the big reasons why you have drug prohibition, is because when a person is addicted to drugs, they are quite unresponsive to changes in the price. They're very focused on getting those drugs, and they're willing to sacrifice a lot of other things in order to get them. Okay, so this is probably more descriptive of the demand in the illegal drug market than this demand curve is. And what does that tell you? It tells you, well, S2 here, this is maybe what the supply would be of illegal drugs if there was no prohibition, if they weren't illegal anymore. You'd have a lower price. There would be more of them that would be consumed. However, given that the demand curve is probably pretty steep, when you restrict the supply by prohibiting drugs, that is going to drive up the price by quite a bit, but it's unlikely to get you a big reduction in the quantity of drugs that are consumed. And also notice that when you move from this point on the demand curve to that point on the demand curve, in revenue terms, the market for drugs actually grows. That is, there is more money being earned by the producers and the sellers of drugs in this market with prohibition than in that market without prohibition, because the price goes up by a lot more than the quantity of units goes down. And now that money is flowing towards drug lords and people who are going to maybe pay off judges and help corrupt police officers. And so that has some negative implications for the outcomes of prosecuting a prohibition on drugs. Okay. One last thing that I'll point out that your textbook talks about is, if you want to shift the supply curve up for, say, drugs, one way of doing that is through prohibition. You just make it illegal. But you could get exactly that same increase in price by placing a tax on the sale of drugs. Okay, so that maybe, heroin, cocaine, whatever, they would be produced by a legal manufacturer who then has to pay a steep tax to the government. And the implications of that are, you could reduce the consumption of drugs by the same amount, but now the extra price is not going to criminal drug dealers. Instead, it's being taxed away, and that revenue is going to the government instead. Okay, so those are a couple of the applications of or policy implications of elasticity of demand. In the next videos, we're going to start turning our attention to elasticity of supply.